all set? We'll do a little bit. Check time. We'll have 2 minutes to get here. 2 minutes. Well, I want to thank you all for coming today. I'm John Brook, and I am the director of the Center for Historical Research, and we are entering our 4th and final semester of the did we start the quarter system? I guess we had 2 quarters, and now we're beginning our 2nd semester of our series on health, disease, and environment and global history. And we have a spectacular lineup for the final sequence. One of the most difficult, methodologically difficult fields in historical work involves the quantitative analysis of medieval economic history. The demands on the medieval economic historian are multiple, from paleography, deciphering the scratches on the page, turning them into time series, and then engaging with the hyper-theoretical economics field. All of this is obviously prefaced to introducing Bruce Campbell, who is Professor Emeritus in Geography at at Queen's University, Belfast, and is one of the world's leading practitioners of European medieval economic history, and specifically English, because really the English records go back to the 1230s, 1240s, maybe a smidgen earlier, and unlike the rest of continental Europe. So Bruce's CV bristles with amazingly empirical, detailed work on agrarian production in England in the Middle Ages, and is really the world's expert on manorial production in England. You'll be seeing some of that today. But in the last, I would say, probably 5 years, he decided that, well, climate matters, weather matters, and he began to work equally assiduously with the quantitative data on the great transition from the efflorescence of the high Middle Ages and the incredible the warmth of the medieval climate anomaly as it declined and collapsed into the Little Ice Ages. And this is the topic of his project today. Now he's added into that the problem of the Black Death. And so we have really 3 things at work here. We have English economic history, we have climate change in an epical transition from warmth to cooling, and we have the problem of the fugitive sources of the Black Death, the bubonic plague. So with that, I'm going to give you Bruce Campbell.
It's extremely nice to be here. I'd like to thank John very much for the invitation and all the arrangements. After the grey skies and the wind and rain of New Orleans, it's very nice to be in a sunny place, a new town, and as yet no rain. I regret I'm going to have to correct my chair at the outset. Anybody who has read medieval documents will know that they're not scratches on the page. That is a better description of my students' handwriting under exam conditions. Medieval documents, one of the great pleasures of being a medieval historian is that the handwriting is fabulously beautiful, and the documents are really wonderful to work with, and that's one of the great pleasures of being a medievalist. And the handwriting is just about, for me, at its most beautiful in the first half of the 14th century. And if you work on the first half of the 14th century, you cannot ignore the weather, because we have the greatest harvest failure leading to the greatest famine in North European history between 1315 and 1321. And you cannot ignore the disease, because, of course, we have the notorious Black Death of the middle years of the 14th century. So climate and disease have always been there in my consciousness. In my most recent work, I'm bringing them a little bit more to the fore, particularly so in this lecture. But I want to start a little bit more conventionally with the date. Half a century ago, when I went to school and did history, people who were good at history were people who were good at remembering dates. And this was the date that every school child in England was expected to remember as an important date in English history. History in those days was basically about chaps, and basically about chaps being successful and victorious. And 1346 was the year that an English invading army of France, led by King Edward III, defeated a larger French army led by Philip VI at the Battle of Cressy, in the first major land battle of what became the 100 Years' War. That was fought in August 1346. And of course that then exposed France to a century of warfare in its own territory, pillage, plunder, and destruction. And less than 2 months later, the English scored another victory over their ancient enemies, the Scots. The Scots had formed what's known as the Old Alliance between Scotland and France against their common enemy, England. And so when England invaded France, the Scots then invaded northern England, led by their King David II. And they were surprised by a much smaller English army outside Durham City, and the English won, thereby avenging the humiliation of their defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn 30 years earlier. And worse for the Scots than defeat was the capture of their King David II. He was taken into captivity. He was first of all shipped off to France to be shown to Edward III, so a captive king, bad lustre to Edward III. And then he was held a captive in England, and an enormous ransom was levied on the Scots for his return. If you wage war against your enemies, in the case of England, your enemies to the north in Scotland and your enemies to the south in France, this is a good way to make your enemies poorer if you're victorious in the enterprise. Plundering, claiming booty, imposing ransom impoverished the Scots and impoverished the French. And it did enrich some leading captains in the English army, but it did not add to the prosperity of the Eurozone, if I might use that modern term, because in the wider scheme of economic things, this added to an already grave economic situation. And of course, wars on this scale, and wars fought outside your own, aggressive wars rather than defensive wars fought in your own country, aggressive wars fought overseas are enormously expensive. And the state finance database, which you can get access to online, charts the rise of English tax revenues, and the level of the tax demands imposed upon ordinary people in England absolutely soared at the outbreak of the 100 Years' War, to levels far above those of Edward III's grandfather, the very belligerent Edward I. And you can see how high the tax, these are net tax revenues, how high they were between 1339 and 1341, and they resulted in a financial constitutional crisis for government in England. And what Edward III was doing was bribing foreign princes to support his claim to the French crown. There was enormous export of bullion, and this led to a sudden deflation of the coinage. And you notice there's a second slightly lower peak in those tax revenues in 1346 here. That's the year of the Cressy campaign. That is the year of the English invasion of France, and it was extremely expensive indeed. So 1346, a date that all English school children once had to remember. I'll come back to it. And so in this period of escalating warfare, we find evidence of deepening economic austerity. It's very difficult at this early stage in the availability of quantitative information to get truly comparable sets of data. So these figures are the best that I can come up with for a range of places. The once hugely important Champagne fairs of central France, where the trade of southern Europe engaged with traders from northern Europe, their tax receipts declined by 60% between the 1320s and the early 1340s. Between the mid-1330s and the mid-1340s, Flemish textile production, the Flemish textile industry was the largest export textile industry in northern Europe. Its production contracted by a third. Receipts from the once important National Fair at St Giles outside Winchester were down by 1/5 just between the 1330s and the 1340s. The real rental value of property in central Cheapside, this is hard by St Paul's Cathedral, right in the commercial heart of the capitals of England, London, the second largest city in northern Europe. The rental values in the 1340s are only half what they had been at the opening of the 14th century. Money supply per person is down by half between 1330 and 1345. This is a massive export. And the value just of ordinary corn mills is down by 1/4. And so in the 1340s we find signs of mounting hardship. Wealth is being siphoned off from ordinary taxpayers to the crown in order to further the dynastic ambitions of Edward III. And so what you have on this graph, the grey background is John Munro's price index. Prices fall because of deflation, because of this export of money. And that, in the short term, is a good thing for ordinary wage earners. It means that their wages paid in pennies will actually buy more because the penny increases in value. So that softens the blow. The 1340s sees only 1 or 2 above average harvests, rather more below average harvest. That's these yellow spikes, and 2 very bad harvest failures. One in 1339, and one, oh look, it's 1346 again that year. So the year of the English invasion of heavy tax demands is also a year of serious harvest failure. There's a steady upward trend in the number of recorded sales of pieces of free land recorded by a type of document known as the feet of fine. So people are selling off land for a whole variety of reasons, but they often do this in order to gain cash to pay taxes, in order to get out of difficult situations. And tellingly, the red line, the number of recorded crimes in the jail delivery rolls goes steadily up in the 1340s to a peak in this hardship year, 1346. And I owe the date of this line to Barbara Hannibal, formerly George III Professor of History in this university, who's put together this absolutely wonderful and highly revealing series. And this is a truly telling indicator of hardship by very ordinary people, turning above all to crimes against property when they are faced by real hardship. So there are signs of increasing hardship in the 1340s. And these ripple out throughout the whole of the northwest European trading zone, which is a very extensive trading zone by this point in the 14th century. No part of northern Europe is beyond that trading zone. And everywhere is on the receiving end of increased taxation and customs duties, bankruptcies of Italian merchant companies. This is the decade when the great Paluzzi and Bardi companies of Florence go bust. Trade embargoes, monetary instability, the physical destruction of capital stock by armies plundering and destroying, and the requisition of merchant vessels for naval use. There is no navy as such when you when you need a navy, you requisition merchant shipping, and then brigandage and piracy as others piggyback on the breakdown of law and order. So it's a very disruptive time. Meanwhile, at the opposite end of the European trading zone, in the Black Sea, which is the point of contact between particularly Genoese merchants and the trans-Eurasian caravan trade from Cathay, hugely important point of interaction, difficulties are also surfacing in the first half of the 14th century. The Christian merchants had found it relatively straightforward dealing with Mongols. They had had big problems dealing with Muslim merchants because of the antipathy between Christianity and Islam. The fall of Acre in 1291 had pushed Christian merchants out of the Middle East and deflected much trade northwards, where it made its outlet in the Black Sea. And the Genoese fought the Venetians for access to and control of that Black Sea trade. So important was it. And trade, the caravan routes round to the northern caravan route round the north of the Caspian Sea terminated at Genoese trading entrepôts, and the more southerly route made its outlet at the port of Trebizond. The 14th century is the great boom century for Trebizond on the Black Sea. But from 1313, the Mongol, they're known as the Golden Horde, or alternatively the Kipchak Khanate, they converted to Islam progressively from 1312. And the hitherto relatively peaceful relations between the Italian merchants and the Kipchak Khanate became much more difficult, and particularly once Univ had become principal Khan from 1342. And this transformed the geopolitics of this vast western portion of what sometimes be called the Pax Mongolica, this great, vast, unified area of interior Eurasia, with no custom boundaries across which you could travel without difficulty. It's like once the United States controlled the whole of the landmass of North America from east-west, and you have relatively easy east-west movement. This is what the Mongol Empire had created in Europe. By 1343, traffic along the northern branch of the Silk Road was obstructed and in effect stopped. That's this branch here, just fades away, and so it's only the southern branch coming out of Trebizond here that remains. And then, more seriously, in 1343 and 1346, that date again, the Genoese colonies at Tara and Kaffa were attacked and besieged. And this is really constricting European trade with the East. Europeans have lost, the Mamluks have pushed the Franks out of the Holy Land, the Mamluks now control the whole of the trade here, the Mongols have deflected trade north here, out to the Black Sea, and now this northern route has been closed off. So trade is now only reaching Europe from the east, up the Persian Gulf, to Brits, or by the southern caravan routes to Brits and Trebizond, and then out past Constantinople, or via the cartel controlled by the Muslim Caribis merchants of Egypt. This is a significant restriction on the situation 50 years earlier, at the great boom time when the Polo family went from Venice to China and back. This is a significant close down that's happening in the 1340s. So by 1340, internationally traded volumes were down, and Janet Agurukov's world system was starting to fracture. And this is, I don't know how many of you do or do not know this, but it's a wonderful book about the way in which all parts of the old world were linked together by the second half of the 13th century into an intellect trading bloc, so that goods could flow from east to west and west to east by these 8 orbits of exchange that she identified. But by the 1340s, the system is breaking down. And to make it worse, in the 1340s, climatic instability was also on the increase. So we have war, commercial and economic recession, already taking place before the war makes it worse, and then we have mounting climatic instability. So this is a period of increasing stress and difficulty. I do low-level statistics because they're easier to explain to myself as well as to other people than high-level statistics. And you can do a lot with a coefficient of variation. It just measures the level of year-on-year variability. So what I'm going to show you are a series of graphs depicting the level of variance, the annual year-to-year variation for a number of proxy measures of climate. This is the variance for Michael Mann's Northern Hemisphere temperature reconstruction. And what you can see is the way in which variance is rising in the first half of the 14th century, falls at the end, and then it rises again in the 15th century. And I marked the 1340s here just to help you focus. This is the variance of the annual series of North Atlantic sea surface temperatures. This is extraordinary. Sea surface temperatures, I live in Ireland, sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic fundamentally affect the weather I get and how wet it is or how dry it is. And you have got a spectacular annual variability in the surface temperatures from warm to cold and cold to warm in the North Atlantic in these middle decades of the 14th century. In the west of Scotland, a detailed analysis of a speleothem, which is basically a stalactite in a cave, Scottish cave, where you get, they're like trees, you get an annual band, which is proportionate to the level of precipitation. And this speleothem has been used to infer annual levels of precipitation in the normally very wet west of Scotland, and it works. There's the one button. Can I go back? The level of variation is very low here, steady, constant, steady annual pattern of rainfall, and then the level of variation goes right up here as you go from wet years to dry years to wet years to dry years, and the weather is swinging backwards and forwards. I think all of us now are accustomed of late to the concept of the climate having become unstable. And here's a historical example of exactly that. And then things settle down. So you go from stability through instability back to stability. These are the ring widths, the annual ring widths of oak trees in the British Isles. And their variability, oak trees like the rain, they like cool wet summers, they don't like hot dry summers. And so we've got very unstable summer conditions, and the variability of oak trees goes up to peak in the 1340s and down again. And this is the variance of grain yields. I put together a 200-year grain yield series from these wonderful documents that we have from medieval England. And again, you can see that grain yields become very unpredictable in the middle years of the 14th century. They're very, very killed. And if I put an average through all of that, that is what you get, the average variance. And it's probably a little easier to see if that is the average variance. And look at how it goes right the way up to a peak in the middle of the 14th century in the 1340s and right the way down. And the book that I found very helpful in understanding what is going on environmentally is the book Critical Transitions in Nature and Society by Dutch ecologist Martin Scheffer, who points out that variance in fluctuations may often increase as a critical transition is approached. So, simply on that observation, this would imply that in the 1340s, at least in northwestern Europe, a critical transition is possibly being approached because of this high level of variance, high level of instability. Another take on the 1340s is provided by dendrochronology, by the annual growth of trees, and what trees thought about growing conditions. Did trees like growing conditions, or did trees dislike growing conditions? And I'm going to show you a series of dendrochronologies for the northern part of Eurasia, starting in the northwest and moving over to the northeast. Here's the first one. This is a dendrochronology for pines in general Scandinavia, what we call Fennoscandia, with a clear downturn here in the 1340s. It's not the only downturn, but a clear downturn in the 1340s. These are pines a little bit further east in the polar Urals, a very similar but not identical chronology, and again a downturn in the 1340s. This is a really interesting one. These are junipers in the Tian Shan Mountains. I don't know if anybody's been there. I'd love to meet somebody. Yeah, they're incredibly beautiful high mountains, deep in the heart of Asia. So you're right in the heart of Central Asia, the Tian Shan Mountains. And you notice how juniper growth has been very vigorous at this point in the 14th century, and then it just collapses down to a very low level here in the 1350s. There's a tremendous decline of the growth there at that time. These are large trees in Mongolia, with a low here in the late 1340s, and in the extreme northeast of Eurasia, these are large trees in Siberia. And the important thing to note about all those different bits of coloured spaghetti on the screen in front of you is the way that there's only one point in the whole 14th century when every single line is below average, and that is the 1340s. At every other point, some of them are above average and some of them are below average, which is what you would think. You expect that trees all over the place, some of them will be growing well and some not so well. You wouldn't expect complete uniformity of growing conditions. But this is a vote on the 1340s by trees right the way across Eurasia. They didn't like growing conditions. And yeah, how do I get rid of that?
Try just to answer.
Got it, okay. And this is a world chronology put together by my colleague Mike Bailey in the Department of Paleoecology at Queen's. And this is from 11 major dendrochronologies from all parts of the northern and southern hemisphere and the old and the new worlds. And you've got a very significant downturn in world tree growth here in the 1340s. So you have a very significant growth downturn in the 1340s. We've got this instability in climate conditions in northwest Europe. Trees all over the world are not growing very well. A whole series of reasons why that might be. And if we move down to Southeast Asia and Southern Asia and look at the strength of the monsoon down there, and we look at a series of precipitation indexes, what we find is that monsoon is weakening, and then in the middle of the 14th century it starts to fail quite seriously, which is a disaster for paddy rice-based civilizations. So this is an index of precipitation based on varve deposits in the Bay of Bengal and a speleosem from India, showing a big downturn in precipitation from the 1330s. This is another index for central and southern China. This one is based entirely upon analysis of speleosem information. And this is a dendrochronologically based drought index for Cambodia. And you can see all of them are picking out the period from 1338 to 1373 as a period of very serious drought. And if I put in the general trend, you can see things are trending downward here, but things, you reach a crisis point here. And it's at this point here, 1342, if you read Timothy Brooks' book, Troubled Empire, about the Yuan and Ming dynasties of China, this is one of his 9 sloughs of despond. Starts in 1342. 1342, another quite significant date in all of this. And if we put in the only available moisture index that we have for the arid interior of Asia. I'm very grateful to John Brooke for making this available to me. And this is only at a decadal level of resolution. The 1340s is the first damp decade in about 200 years. But seriously arid conditions in the interior Asia are beginning to ease in the 1340s. But again, you can see the instability. Arid decades, damp decade, back to arid, back to damp again. So when you get a period of climate change, the best analogy I can give you, a period of climate change, I don't know how many of you do sailing. And if you tack in a boat, and you have your sails in tight, and everyone is leaning against the wind, and you're sailing along, and everything is stable. And then you come to the end of your tack, and you have to go in the opposite direction, and suddenly the boat tilts in the opposite direction, the boom swings across, you have to tighten some boats, let out some boats, and that's the point of danger when you might capsize or be overtaken in a race. Okay, so going from one stable tack to what you hope is going to be another stable tack through a period of instability in between. And the periods of instability are the periods of risk. Risk is heightened in all kinds of ways. And that's one of the key themes of what I'm trying to say here. So to sum up so far, the 1340s witnessed heightened climatic variability, depressed tree growth right across northern Eurasia as well as globally, a weakening of the southern Asian monsoon and the onset of mega-drought in formerly stable paddy farming civilizations and increased humidity in long arid Central Asia. And it's in this very specific climatic context that plague makes its first recorded appearance in the lands of the Kipchak Khanate between the Caspian and the Black Seas in 1346. This outbreak is well attested from a number of different historical sources, so we can be very confident that the plague did break out. Scythia is this area here between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. We can be very confident that plague did surface here in 1346. It's our first certain reference to the deadly disease, well attested by a number of sources. And by October 1347, Genoese fleeing Catha, which has been besieged by now plague-infested Mongols, succeed in taking the disease with them to Messina in Sicily. And once it gets to this island, right in the heart of Mediterranean trade and commerce, there will be no stopping it. And it will then sweep through the whole of North Africa and the greater part of Western Europe. This is the only certain documented outbreak that we have. There have been suggestions in the literature, and these have been much repeated, but they hang on a very, very slender piece of evidence from a Russian excavation in the 1880s of cemeteries at Issyk-Kul in the heart of Eurasia by one of the northern branches of the Silk Road, to large numbers dying of pestilence in 1338 to 1339. Before we know, the pestilence was Asian flu and not plague. Okay, we have no more certain diagnosis than that. And it has been suggested that the clearly very lethal epidemics reported in Chinese chronicles for the period 1331 to 1334 could conceivably have been the Black Death. Those who think that the Black Death spread like flu, flu always starts, it's always Asian flu, isn't it? It always starts in the, well, I'm a European, always starts in Asia and moves west. And the kind of, there's this assumption that the Black Death must have done something similar. It started in the East, you put all the blame on the Chinese, and then it slowly spreads westwards until this intersection between Asian trade and European trade in the Black Sea brings it into Europe. So that is the implicit assumption. And of course, it is made explicit in the marvelous book William McNeill's Plagues and Peoples, published in 1978, where he argues that it was the intensification of overland caravan movement across Asia that reached its climax under the Mongol empires, affected both macro and micro parasitic patterns in far-reaching ways. So his idea was that the creation of the Mongol Empire, the establishment of these overland trade routes that made their outlet to the Black Sea, this meant that trade was flowing east to west, and the traders, one way or another, took the pathogen with them until it surfaced in the Kipchak Khanate in 1346, if not a little sooner. Was the plague? Most people, when they talk about plague, they mean bubonic plague or Yersinia pestis. And anybody who's engaged with this subject or will realize that over the last 20 years or so, an increasingly heated and aggressive debate has been waged between those who were adamant that, yes, the Black Death was Yersinia pestis, it was bubonic plague, and the people named as the Black Death deniers, who argued that certainly a large number of people have died, but what was killing them was not Yersinia pestis, it was some other disease. The main problem for the Black Death deniers was to come up with a convincing alternative disease. So they tended to resort to the argument, well, it burnt itself out, so we don't really know what it was. Because there were a number of features of the Black Death that are very, very perplexing in terms of the known behaviour of bubonic plague as a disease, and there were very good grounds for questioning whether what ripped through the population of Europe was bubonic plague at all. It's a bacterial infection. You need a vector to spread it. The natural hosts of it are wild mammals. A whole range of mammals can be natural hosts to it. In the southwest of the United States they have it. Prairie dogs and squirrels now are the hosts of Yersinia pestis. So if you go down to Arizona, you can catch the Black Death. You know, if you're unguarded. It can be safely treated with antibacterial antibiotics today, so it's no longer a killer disease. But it's normally spread by an insect, a vector, and it's the flea that spreads it. The World Health Organization believe they can never eradicate it because the bacterium can survive in the soil, in the burrows of these, particularly in Asia, gerbils and marmots. So the prospect of eradication is highly unlikely. So is this the disease? Well, we now have answers that certainly the geneticists are convinced. It's right here at the American Historical Association meeting in New Orleans, from which John and I have just returned. The geneticists are absolutely convinced that this disease of Black Death was Yersinia pestis. The aDNA analysis conducted on the soft pulp of teeth of datable plague victims from mass plague burials at a number of sites tests carried out by independent laboratories have consistently shown that Yersinia pestis was present in the teeth of those numbers of those victims. So the evidence comes from France, Italy, southern Germany, the Netherlands, and England. It doesn't yet come from Sicily, the Balkans, the Crimea, Scythia, Kazakhstan, China. And we have no archaeological evidence, no aDNA analysis from 14th century burials in those parts. It would be very interesting should that evidence ever come to light. So this is evidence coming from westernmost Western Europe, where there have been the funds for archaeology to be undertaken. Did the disease originate in China? Well, the biological evidence points in that direction. And if you look at what the biologists are saying, and I give you some excerpts here, they believe that the greatest range of types of Yersinia pestis is present in China, which is a good circumstantial indication of a Chinese origin. They believe that Chinese genotypes are the closest to those that they've identified in the teeth of European plague victims. And the most recent study by Giovanna Morelli and 23 other scientists. So when you, between every et al. In a scientific publication now is kind of like 2 soccer teams of scientists. Phylogenetic analysis implies that Yersinia pestis evolved in China and spread to other areas on multiple occasions, reaching Syria from China via the Silk Road. That's the biological evidence, but it is not confirmed by the available historical evidence. And the verdict, the consistent verdict the historians are coming up with, and this is largely Western historians working at second or third hand from the original Chinese sources, is that although there are accounts of serious epidemics in China, none of those epidemics have clearly documented symptoms that would correspond with the Black Death diagnosis. Nor have there been the detailed studies of the distribution of mortality, monthly patterns of deaths and so forth that would also lead to such an interpretation. And I quote the most recent summary of the Western literature on this by George Sussman, and his verdict was the epidemics of 14th century China were not plague. So the jury is out on this one. There's a difference between what the biological evidence is implying, what Western readings of the Chinese sources is suggesting. So I come back to the fact our earliest certain outbreak, datable outbreak, is the 1340 outbreak in Western Eurasia. It suits my argument that that should be the case. Could plague outbreaks have been triggered by climate? The answer is yes. There's a small but growing body of research into this, looking at patterns of plague in the 20th century, particularly in Russia. The Russians kept very, very good records over the course of the 20th century, particularly in Kazakhstan. A 2010 study notes that climate changes have been implicated in outbreaks of human plague through their effect upon host density, just how many mammals there are who are the hosts of the disease, on the numbers and behavior of the flea vectors. The temperature itself affects the bacterium, and often several factors interact together. And there are very clear correlations between local outbreaks of plague and annual variations in weather conditions. And building on these insights, Anthony McMichael has proposed a 5-stage plague cycle whereby a simple zootic of wild rodents was eventually transformed via a combination of environmental and biological shifts into a deadly and fast-spreading pandemic capable of changing the course of history, as did the Black Death. Stage 1 is the zootic stage, with harsh climatic conditions on the Central Asian steppes, limiting biomass output, vegetation growth, food availability, and consequently populations of gerbils and fleas and endemic stocks of the bacterium. So these arid conditions that prevailed in the 12th and 13th centuries kept populations of gerbils and marmots in Central Asia down. So there was a limited stock of the bacterium under those conditions. If you improve climatic conditions in Central Asia, which typically meant raising temperatures and or raising moisture levels, then you increase the amount of vegetation, you increase food availability, and that will lead to a sustained increase of gerbils and marmots and their fleas. And that will boost endemic stocks of the Yersinia pestis bacterium. And theoretically, when my biologist friends tell me that pathogens have a vested interest in not killing their hosts. When there are a lot more hosts around, you can afford to become a bit more lethal. So the argument is that as rodent populations went up, then there's the potential for the bacterium to become more virulent. Let's suddenly change the weather conditions. Turn off the rain, turn down the temperature. So that suddenly those increased populations of gerbils and marmots are starving and dying. What then do all the blood-sucking fleas support living off those gerbils and marmots do? Well, at that point, they migrate. Humans do this when the climate becomes inhospitable. You migrate. So the fleas migrate and look for an alternative host. And at this point, the fleas abandon the wild rodents and move in to what are known as the commensal-rodents, the domestic rodents, which are basically domestic rats. And the commensal rodents are much less resistant to the bacterium. So they succumb much more readily and in much greater numbers. And so you have a pan-zoonotic of domestic rodents. You have a serious disease, killer disease, killing off the domestic rodents. So once again, the fleas, hungry for another meal, have to find an alternative source. And at this point, the fleas start biting the humans and injecting the humans with the bacterium, and the humans start to contract and die of bubonic plague. It is a very inefficient and clumsy mechanism of disease spread, which is why when you get plague spread in this fashion from the fleas of domestic rodents biting humans and injecting them, the rate of spread is slow. The number of humans who contract the infection is relatively low, and you get if it spreads at all, you get a very, very slow-moving disease event. And that's why you have so many plague deniers over the last 20 years, because it's transparent from the medieval sources that the Black Death moved very fast and killed on a very large scale. And bubonic plague spread by this mechanism does neither of those things. The fifth stage is the most hypothetical of McMichael's 5 stages, and is supported by some observations and by some lab experiments. If at this stage human ectoparasites, the human flea and the human lice, become involved, and they become vectors of spread, then plague becomes unfettered from its dependence upon an accompanying pan-zoonotic, and is free to spread independently of rodent hosts. And then it can take on the appearance of a viral infection. Okay, we all know what a viral infection is. You know, I cough over the charming ladies in the front row. Okay, they go off and cough over somebody else, and sooner or later we spread the infection by a human-to-human process of contagious infection. And it looks as though the Black Death is doing that. In fact, it's not. It's more likely that it's human lice and human fleas that are the point of spread from one human to another. So full-scale pan-continental plague pandemics, they are the exception, not the rule. They are very rare and unusual events. It's very difficult to ignite them. They don't happen very often at all. There have only been 3 in the last 2 millennia. To get a full-scale pan-continental plague pandemic, you need a change of hosts, first from sylvatic-rodents then to commensal-rodents, then from commensal-rodents to humans, and you need a change of vectors from rodent fleas to human fleas, and then possibly, and less certainly, to human lice. Only once both biological changes had occurred did plague acquire the capacity to spread rapidly and lethally through human populations, doing so independently of an accompanying pan-zoonotic of rodents. And if It does so at a point when your population densities are high, your populations are closely interconnected through contacts, networks of trade, networks of administration, and so forth, as was very much the case in Latin Christendom by the early 14th century. And if furthermore your populations of recently and or concurrently are being exposed to harvest failure and food shortage with all the breakdowns of public health and congestion, you have created the ideal human preconditions for the rapid spread of a pandemic. This hypothesized scenario resolves 5 key features of the Black Death which have long perplexed historians and led some to question whether plague could have been Yersinia pestis at all. The first, here I quote the great American medievalist David Herlihy. One of the puzzles is you don't find references to dead rats in the 14th century sources for Europe. And he says, to my knowledge, not a single Western chronicler notes the occurrence of an epizootic, the massive mortalities of rats which ought to have preceded and accompanied the human plague. Humans in the classic bubonic epidemiology can contract the disease only from a dying rodent. Unless the rodents die, the human population remains untouched. And the sources are entirely silent on this. And people say, oh, well, it was so commonplace to find dead rats all over the place, nobody commented on it. I don't find that a very convincing explanation, especially as in later Asian sources there are clear references to rodents dying and then humans dying. People might have observed and made the connection. Secondly, the plague appears to spread in a human-to-human pattern. It doesn't have an airborne pattern. It goes from port to port, from town to town, village to village. The old notion was that basically rats are kind of hijacking their way, not hijacking, hitchhiking their way around Europe, taking the plague with them, or their fleas are hiding in bales of cloth and so forth. This is all rather far-fetched. You don't need any of that argument if it's basically humans and human fleas and human mice who are doing the travelling. And there's a seasonal peak, which is partly to do with temperature effects upon the bacterium, but also because there was far more movement, greater mobility in the summer months and the winter months in Europe. Third feature is it spread far and wide, from the Mediterranean right up into Norway, into Scandinavia, from the Black Sea in the east over to Ireland and the Atlantic in the west. The geographical dispersal within very few years was extremely wide. Nobody was immune. It struck at all social classes. These are levels of mortality calculated by John Hatcher for different social groups in England. The people who got off best here are the bishops. They had the lowest mortality. Abbots did much worse because they lived communally, and monks did very badly because they shared dormitories. So the communal living was led to very high death rates for the regular clergy. The benefice clergy, who were ministering to the sick and dying, suffered very high mortality rates. And customary tenants, these are servile tenants on English manors, the highest mortality rates of all. So the poorest and those most exposed to infection suffer the highest death rates, but death rates are high across all social classes. It does not discriminate socially. It's totally unaffected by how well fed you are or how grand your house is. And it spread extraordinarily fast. If you look at the speed of spread of a viral epidemic, and we could do a direct comparison with the Great Rinderpest epidemic that spread from Central Europe in 1316 to Ireland in 1321, very fast spreading viral epidemic of cattle. The Black Deaths spread 5 times faster than a viral epidemic of cattle. So it has to have a very efficient mechanism of spread to have achieved that. It's spreading at a rate, the most recent estimate is 1.5 to 6 kilometers a day. Far faster than the Indian pandemic of the 20th century, which had railway trains to help it spread. So it is a very fast-spreading epidemic. This is the monthly pattern of spread of a late 16th century plague, closely studied by two very celebrated plague deniers, Scott and Duncan. And the single best documented spread we have, the equivalent community in the Black Death, is the little town of Givry in Burgundy. And this is its pattern of spread. You see how fast it rips through this Burgundian community of 2,000 people. In 5 months, it's ripped through devastating results, moving faster than the late 16th century outbreak. Very, very fast spread. And a close analysis of dates of death of beneficed clergy and dates of institution of new clergy in the Bishop's Registers for the Diocese of Coventry and Lichfield, published in 2003, came to the conclusion the Black Death spread too rapidly between locales to have been a zoonosis, such as bubonic plague. It's very interesting that Wood was a plague denier, and now he has conceded. He's one of the co-authors of one of the It Was Yersinia Pestis articles. So he has been totally persuaded by the ADNA evidence. And if you read the work by the biologists, they say the key issue now is the vector. We know what the disease was. The key issue is the vector and the environmental context within which the disease broke out and was spreading. So attention is shifting, and so the biologists realize that weather and climate matters, but also these other factors matter. In England, the massive and immediate post-plague hike in farm labourers' wages bears witness to the scale of the demographic hemorrhage. We do not have census data. It's very difficult to truly measure what this does to population. We measure it independently by what it does to wage rates. If you suddenly massively reduce the supply of labour, it increases the bargaining power of labour, and that would generally lead to higher wage rates. Look at this. Here's the Great Famine, the worst famine in North European history. And people die, labour becomes scarcer, and there's some modest increase in nominal wages. In the Black Death, a farm labourer could demand whatever he liked. They didn't succeed in paying to all of the wage improvements they had negotiated in the middle of the pandemic. So you see in the aftermath of the Black Death that the wage rates come down a little bit, but they don't come down remotely to where they had been. And then there are successive outbreaks, and these have not been properly researched. Anybody looking for a terrific doctoral or postdoctoral project leading to a book that will be massively cited, there is no proper study yet of the 1360 to 61 European plague outbreak. We know next to nothing about the third worst mortality disaster of the last 700 years in European history. All the attention has gone on 1346 to 53, and very little systematic attention has been paid to any of these succeeding outbreaks. None of them kills on the scale of the first, which is a puzzle. It implies immunity, but it's been doubted whether you could acquire immunity. So there are a number of puzzles about what is happening medically and biologically as these successive outbreaks come along, or where they come from. It has plague, once it's arrived, gone underground and then resurfacing? Or is each of these, because they spread like waves across Europe, or is each a re-invasion of Europe? And if so, where is it coming from? So there are huge question marks about all of these subsequent plagues, but what they do is they ensure there is no recovery. After the Black Death, it's a surge of marriages, surge of births, ideal opportunities for starting a family, plenty of jobs, plenty of land, and the population, what Malthus would predict is you should get a full-scale population recovery in the aftermath of such a disaster. And each subsequent plague eliminates the recovery. and pushes the population down and shifts the social structure of the population towards social groups who marry prudently and a little later and away from labouring families who would have married earlier and more biologically. So, Black Death. It's not a Malthusian crisis. This is not an economic disaster. It is a biological event in the first analysis, but it's more than that. This is not a Malthusian crisis. Nor is it, as some historians in the past have chosen to deal with it, an act of God. You know, one of these bolts from the blue. We don't have to really worry what it was or why it was. We just have to see it happen. It killed a lot of people and changed the course of history. And I think that the job of the historian is to understand everything that is shaping the course of history. It's something that arose from a unique conjunction of climatic, ecological, biological, and human circumstances. It was this conjunction of variables at a particular point in time that produced this particular disaster. And the ingredients are there: climatic change and instability, ecological stress, substitutions of pestis hosts and vectors, key biological changes, war, high densities of closely networked virgin soil populations. You put those four components together, you get the Black Death. And it took all four of those components, I would argue, for this particular event to have occurred. Within a context of ongoing climate change, eruption of the Black Death initiated a new biological era. You go into a plague era, from an era that had been plague-free to an era where plague remained. It didn't leave northwestern Europe until the end of the 17th century. It didn't quit the Ottoman Empire until far later in the 18th century. So it became an essential biological fact of life for the next 300-400 years. So, and it does this in the context of continuing climate change. And I put up there a few indicators of climate. This is solar irradiance, which John Book and I are reassured has an important bearing upon global climate systems. This is the North Atlantic Oscillation, which determines how mild and wet or cold and dry the weather is over northwestern Europe. And these are two temperature reconstructions. So you can see all of them are moving into a period of continuing climate change, which there are now little ice age deniers, but most people would argue that what you're doing is moving away from the medieval climate anomaly into a different climate system. And that different climate system from 1346 is also a different biological system. So this ensures that there is no return to the ecological status quo ante. You do not get back to the environmental conditions that have prevailed before, ever. There's been a system change. The Black Death was also the catalyst of abrupt and enduring demographic change. High population densities within 50 years were cut back by half. And you go from a high pressure equilibrium, high population densities, to a period of demographic collapse to a low pressure equilibrium. And Europe only begins to recover from that, and the European populations only start growing again from the end of the 15th century. And of course it's not until the late 16th and early 17th century that there were enough Europeans to embark upon the colonization, effective colonization of North America. And there are also abrupt economic changes, and I've been doing some work with a group of historians reconstructing national income for a number of European countries. This is an estimate from two Spanish colleagues of GDP per capita in Spain. And this is very interesting. Spain is very thinly peopled on the eve of the Black Death. It's not an overpopulated country, it's an underpopulated country on the eve of the Black Death. If you wipe out half the population, this is an economic disaster for the Spanish, and GDP per capita falls. We'll never be able to measure it, but I bet something like that happened in large parts of Scandinavia, in Ireland where I live, in all the more thinly peopled parts of Europe. The Black Death meant that you could not sustain existing levels of economic activity. GDP per capita fell. This is Italy, the leading economy, although it had been in serious decline in the early 14th century. It goes through a period of hiatus, and then GDP per capita rises to a Renaissance high at this point. This is England, which benefits enormously from the loss of numbers. Okay? There's no cloud without a silver lining. If you survived, you're much better off. And this is Holland, which will go on to become the leading European economy in its golden age in the 16th and 17th centuries. And note that these two backward economies are the most dynamic, and these two Mediterranean, well, Spain is Atlantic as well as Mediterranean, don't do as well. So there was a division opening up here. And the Black Death reaffirms Western Europe as a high-wage economy. Labour is scarce and it's expensive, so you substitute draft animals and machinery for labour. You invest in labour-saving technology and the creation of human capital. It becomes, again, a region of land-extensive mixed farming with a lot of pastoral production. Pastoral outputs are a large part of agricultural output. The Europeans wear clothes made of wool. Asians wear clothes made of cotton. It says a lot about the different agricultural structures. And Europe becomes relatively wealthy with levels of GDP per capita, which mean that you have a choice. Once you've satisfied your income, you can either put your feet up and take more leisure, which is what most farm workers chose to do, or if you were an artisan, you could, once you satisfied subsistence, you could work a little more, and you could enjoy some of the new consumer goods that were becoming available. And from this great transition, the great divergence that Ken Pomerantz has written about, and another great debate that has focused on that, between the increasingly capital-intensive economies of the North Sea region and the labour-intensive economies of Southeast Asia, and especially Eastern China, would in due course flow. So the Black Death marks a considerable economic divide. I'm going to try and round this up now very quickly. Economic historians, medieval economic historians, have tried to account for the changes of the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries, largely with reference to economic theories. And when I was starting my career, there was a big debate, it was called the Brenner debate, between a Marxist interpretation of economic development versus a neoclassical interpretation of economic development. And all the key factors were seen to be internal to society. Environmental factors scarcely intruded upon this debate, and there was even an attempt by Poston to downplay the Black Death, very inconvenient the Black Death, and to play up the Great Famine, because the Great Famine looked more like a conventional Malthusian crisis. And all of these theories give very valuable insights, but they have failed to explain the totality of what has happened. Nor do I think environmental determinism can provide an adequate answer. There was a very provocative article published in 2011 by David Zhang and several colleagues, made newspaper headlines in the UK. And they claim climate change was the ultimate cause. Climate-driven economic downturn was the direct cause of large-scale human crises in pre-industrial Europe and the Northern Hemisphere. And I think that is too reductionist and far too simplistic. I do not find that. It may work at a general level. I think when you scrutinize it in detail, it fails. And that is the ultimate historical test. As the Great Transition unfolded, interactions and feedbacks, environmental and human, occurred at a range of nested temporal and spatial scales, from the short term to the long term and the micro to the macro, as change cascaded through the prevailing socio-ecological system in complex ways. This is an incredibly complex historical event. Such a cascading process defies any simple law of cause and effect, And as a reminder that each stage in the transition was unique. This is good news for historians. Okay? What we are seeing here is not the working out of some iron law of economics or some iron law of ecology. Now, the laws of economics and ecology provide insights because contingency, chance, accident is important at all stages, climatically, ecologically, biologically, and in terms of human beings. So what was the Great Transition? It's an example of contingent, chaotic development. Thank you.
I think if this is ready, we can open up the floor to commentary. I'm going to get out of the way. I have a bar toothpick, but I'll save that for later.
I wondered if you have any data. You mentioned the Ottoman Empire, but apparently the plague was devastating to Egypt and North Africa. And even reading your chapter, couldn't find you had any evidence on climate for that area.
Yeah, I did not look closely at that, Barbara. Is that still wrong? Yeah. That, of course, is the subject of the book by Michael Dawes, which I've looked at but not engaged with closely. The simple answer is no, I haven't looked at it. The simple answer is I don't have any data. The other answer is in terms of this climatic, biological, economic interaction, it is less important to my argument. So the part of Africa that interests me more is, say, Morocco.
Yes.
Because the dendrochronologies for Morocco pick up changes in the westerlies and in moisture levels. I think that's the fairest answer I can give you, but I will go back and look again at Michael Dawes.
But it doesn't matter. In other words, essentially the climate story happens in Central Asia. And the pulse, the role it kind of plays is in the disturbance of the rodent hosts. Once that happens on the loose, it really doesn't matter what the climate is in the Middle East, in Egypt, because it's going to hit, no matter what the climate is, it's going to have the effect. That'll be aware.
Yeah, yeah. The frustrating thing about the climate data is, and it's only very recently I've come to this realization, is that what's going on in Western Europe is really rather beside the point. And most of the literature on the Black Death is written about the Black Death in Western Europe. We were on the receiving end of it. It didn't originate in Western Europe. And we got it in the neck from it, okay? But it was coming from somewhere else. So it's the conditions, human and environmental, in the places of origin. This is why where it first erupted is so important, and when it first erupted. Because if it wasn't in 1340, if it was in China in 1331, let us say, then it's the conditions prevailing in China in 1331 are fundamentally important. But at the moment, all the evidence points towards Central Asia, which is where we have the weakest high-resolution data, partly because we don't have many good dendrochronologists, because it's the steppes of Central Asia. They don't have any trees.
Yes. I have a question about the geographic spread of the plague. Statements like 6 kilometers a year or 10 kilometers a year suggest this tsunami that's rolling across Europe. Yet any reasonable thinking about the mechanism of transmission would think of vectors or tentacles, whereby on the front of this tsunami there would be more advanced placement of the disease based upon trade, migration, and things of that sort. Can you speak to how?
I think I don't have a cue hearing. I missed the middle part of your points there.
Well, I would think that the spread of the disease, I mean, it's depicted as like a tsunami.
Yes.
Rolls across Europe suddenly, this big wave out of the Middle East. But given if it's driven by lice or driven by rats and fleas, one would think it would spread more quickly and penetrate more rapidly and more severely along vectors of trade and commerce. Can you speak to this question about the geographic spread?
Yeah. I was at an international economic history meeting, and there was a very strange paper by a young economist reconstructing patterns of mid-14th century trade in Europe using the evidence of the outbreak of the Black Death as evidence of contact between places. This is kind of inverse reasoning. The most recent study of the spread of plague has been done by a GIS-led team by a man called Christopos, who's written a book and an article on the subject. And to really track the spread of the disease, you need date of outbreak, first outbreak, at a very high level of resolution. So they did a lot of careful work trying to find when could you really date when this outbreak first appeared, or when did it last appear in a community. Just say 1348 or 1349 doesn't really help in terms of working out exactly the routes that are being taken. In a general sense, the spread is following trade routes. There's no doubt about it. The Genoese bring it to Sicily. They take it to Italy. It first arrives in England at the port of Melcombe, now Weymouth on the south coast of England. It then spreads to Bristol, which would have had direct contacts. In the following year, it gets to London, and then it spreads north. So this is why it has very much a sort of human-to-human pattern of spread. One thing I am not clear in my own mind about it, though, is the whole business of incubation. Is how far you could travel before you succumbed. I think if you're taking infected ectoparasites with you, you've got to be well enough to travel a considerable distance. This has been one of the big problems with the spread. If you suddenly contract pneumonic plague, you become too ill too quick to go anywhere. So for this to be spread by humans and human ectoparasites, they've got to be innocent enough of the disease and well enough and fit enough to be able to travel using medieval methods of travel considerable distances and over water as well as over land. And if you read the literature, there's no clear conclusion as yet to be drawn about that. So, yeah, I can't give you a sufficiently clear answer to your question, because I think there are still so many big questions hanging over this particular disease and how it did spread. Humans were clearly complicit in the spread. But exactly how, I'm less certain. You'll have to speak up for me.
Yeah. About incubation during the third modern pandemic, I believe they say about 10 to 12 days. That's why several quarantining efforts did not really help, depending on the mode of travel of a person from place to place. Even railway stations, when they had quarantining measures, they were ineffective, because if it were a short travel, say 3 to 4 days, it was difficult to figure out, you see, the carriers, in a sense. But that was, of course, for the modern pandemic of the 1890s.
Quarantine began with the Venetians.
True, in the Middle
The first
Ages.
time to introduce it
Right.
was what is now Dubrovnik, Ragusa, and they had a quarantine of 30 days, and then they extended it to 40 days quarantina. And the towns that had it periodically failed, and then they had devastating outbreaks again. But I've never known quite how much to lay on that.
And then again, pneumonic variations would obviously be faster compared to
Yeah.
the pneumonic
Thank
times.
you.
You've shifted up. I mean, I'm worried about climate.
Because on the one hand, we have this focus on the rising moisture in Central Asia from the shift to the westerlies, which is sort of the opening over the previous, say, 75 years. The medium climate anomaly has declined, and we have, has cooled down. We have this stability, and then we have the impact of all this moisture, or the beginnings of this moisture in Central Asia on the soil population is setting off this interactive process. But what's your position on the possible weakening of the resistance of European populations, north and west in particular, from the erratic rainfall that has been in play since about 1275 that really does set off the famine? How much interpretive weight would you put on that, on instabilities running back into the previous century that are hypothetically maybe weakening, quote unquote, the resistance of European populations?
I'm very skeptical about that. Partly because, that graph I showed of mortality by different social groups, bishops didn't have their rations cut, nor did abbots. They were largely above the impact of scarcity and want and abundance. And yet the Black Death did not discriminate between the badly fed and the well-fed. What I do think, and there have been attempts to argue that the Great Famine kind of softened up populations, and if that was at all the case, the difference it would have made would, I think, have been marginal to the outcome. What I think might have made a little bit more difference is the fact that there was this terrible Italian famine in 1346 to 47, and it's in 1347 that the disease arrives. So you have Florence's coffers empty, you have people who've had serious malnutrition, and then right on top of that in comes the plague. You had breakdowns of public health and public order. In England, the harvest failed in 1349, the second year of plague, and 1350 and 1351. Whenever harvest fails, people congregate together, sanitation breaks down. So if the human lice is a key vector in the spread of plague, that will create, just as all typhus epidemics surge during famine conditions. So if the lice, if lice are involved, this is ideal precondition. So this will give an extra nudge to the spread of the disease, or it will accelerate the spread. How much difference it then makes, whether those people would have got it anyway and would have died anyway, we will never know. For me, the important thing on the human side is the extraordinary growth of these commercial civilizations in Latin Christendom in the 12th and 13th century, in China and all places in between. The build-up of population densities, establishment of connections, interconnections. These are highly interconnected, mobile populations, and that is absolutely ideal for the rapid dissemination of a pandemic like this. You could not have had a pandemic like this in the 10th century. Population densities weren't there, the interconnections weren't there. Okay? Once you create, this is Lopez is the commercial revolution of the 12th and 13th centuries. And it just created the infrastructure for a major pandemic. So yes?
So you were saying that the bacteria found in Europe is closely related to the bacteria found in China, but they don't have the same kind of symptoms that were found in Europe. Could it be that when changing hosts along the road, and in the dramatic climate changes, that the bacteria itself also changed, and that's why we don't see the same symptoms?
The biologists say no. They say that this is a bacterium that has changed remarkably little. It has evolved and it has changed, and there are different strains, so they can track the different strains. But they say that the 14th century bacterium found through aDNA analysis is almost identical with the genome that they've identified in China. So they do not see a fundamental change. There was, many people have speculated that medieval plague was simply far more virulent, and that plague has lost its power to kill. But what the biologists seem to be saying is it's changed remarkably little. What clearly does change is the vector. Once you change the vector, you can change the dissemination and the impact. And of course, public health, public hygiene, and in the 20th century, scientific knowledge all make those differences. But many people have speculated as you have, but I have to defer to the biologists. I'm not in a position to challenge them, and they say no.
Would people in Central Asia a bit more used to it, build up more of a resistance? Would they have been able to tolerate it better than Americans?
Well, the implication of the material I presented this afternoon is that it was completely new in the Kipchak Khanate. That it may well have been present, probably was present in example of biological warfare.
Sir?
Would you categorize
This as a, no, because I have come to the conclusion that labeling things endogenous or exogenous is completely distracting. It's a false dichotomy. Because the way I try to present this, I just go back. I don't think I can find the right one. The point of my logo, I plagiarized this from the web, but I slightly changed it so I can show it without having a brass copyright. Is that all of these things intersect. There are areas where society is absolutely paramount, and there are areas where ecology is absolutely paramount, and ditto for climate and disease. But in large areas of our life on this planet, where we are biological animals as well as human animals, these things are intersecting. But that's the whole point of this logo, is to try and emphasize that there's nothing that is entirely endogenous or nothing entirely exogenous. All these things interact. And as we know, today, this has an effect on this.
But if the climate had done, I mean, the point is that it isn't all endogenous. The traditional interpretation is, Marxist interpretation of population,
Oh, yeah.
is that it's all internal. So it is an interpretation that includes major exogenous features.
Well, I began with the 100 Years' War with crisis and recession in the Eurozone, monetary instability, banks going bust, including those for which rescue plans have been put together. It's all happened before. This the prosperous medieval commercial world of the 13th century is in tatters by the 1340s, and the Italian economy, then as now, is doing very, very badly. They have declining GDP per capita, they have falling real wage rates according to Power Labor Animals estimates. The leading economy of the Western world is in great difficulty in the first half of the 14th century, and that is then reinforced by shifts in the West Indies, wetter weather, so they have a very bad famine in 1329 to 30, they have another serious dearths in 1340-41, they have another in 1346-47, so they have a lot of difficulty. Meanwhile, one city-state is waging war with another city-state and doing all those kind of things. War has a lot to account for in this worsening commercial situation. So we have a seriously worsening commercial situation, a more and more unstable and difficult climate. But if you had just those two things together, you would not have had the Black Death and everything that happened from that. Okay? What makes the difference in Western Europe is the Black Death, and the key trigger there is a pathogen introduced from Central Asia to Western Europe, and triggered by the conjunction of particularly in Central Asia, it's about climate, ecology, and disease are critically important.
So the reciprocal feedback.
Sorry?
The reciprocal feedback.
Absolutely. Yeah. At all stages there are these interactions, and they occur, as I've got here, in the long term and the short term, and at different scales. So I don't know how I can disentangle this, and the point of these other slides, see this one, if you look at the historiography, which is brilliantly summarized in this very readable and useful book by Ron Hatcher and Mark Vega, I put it up not to criticize it. It is an excellent introduction to the main concepts that medieval historians have used to try and engage with what is happening. The problem is that none of the concepts adequately deal with all of the variables, and because they're largely economic concepts of issues of property rights and class conflict, a balance between population and resources, Smithian growth, or the card diminishing returns, or the efficiency or otherwise of institutions. These are all very much economic explanations, and they can explain a lot about why you have the austerity and the hardship and the problems, which are very clear to see in the early 14th century, but they absolutely cannot explain it like this. And if you look at the index and look up climate change, climatic instability, and so forth, and if you go to the opposite extreme and say, well, it's all to do with climate, again, this is privileging one variable over all others. And I think that is a mistake. As far as I'm concerned, there are 4 variables with sub-variables. The 4 variables are climate, disease, ecology, and society. And the sub-variables are the humans themselves, and we're biological as well as economic agents, and the microbes. So I now try not to use the endogenous or the exogenous as terms, because I think that is actually misleading. And I think it's a bad habit for historians, because the endogenous things tend to imply these are the things we need to understand and write about, and the exogenous are things we can just put to one side. We don't need to work out what they are. If the critical trigger of change is a war, historians would normally want to know what caused the war. If the critical change is a sudden shift in prevailing wind directions and levels of rainfall, historians are less likely to inquire about what caused the shift in weather patterns and so forth. But I think to be a good historian nowadays, you need to understand all of these and how they interact. So that is the thrust of what I've been trying to argue this afternoon.
On that note, I recommend that we give Bruce a big hand. I want to thank you all for coming, and in about a month, on the 1st of February, just less than a month, 3 weeks, we will have a session. Larry Weevil and Julie Lewis will be here to do a dual seminar on health in East and South Africa, and we will be